Pearl Jam's 1994 hit song, Better Man, is one of the most haunting songs that you can hear. It tells the story of a woman who sticks with an abusive, cheating husband because, as the song says repeatedly, she can't find a better man. It was written by the lead vocalist when he found out that his mother had married a man who was not his father, just because she needed someone to help pay the bills and help be there to raise him, even though he wasn't a good man. As the song says, she couldn't find a better man. Not in the sense of that no one was better than him, but because he wasn't all that great, but she couldn't find anything any better. And while the song is hauntingly sad, it should turn our minds to, of all things, 1 Samuel 15 and King David. Not because David is mentioned by name in the chapter, he's not, and not because Saul was such an unfaithful king, he was, but because of the haunting statement in verse 28. Let's read 1 Samuel 15, verse 28, and then we'll get a little bit of a background to the statement. 1 Samuel 15, verse 28, so Samuel said to him, speaking to Saul, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. So that's where we get the idea of a better man from 1 Samuel 15, verse 28. Well, let's get a little bit of the background to this. If you recall, Saul had been established as king and had already had his conflicts with God and shown his unfaithfulness back in chapter 13 and 14. But in chapter 15, we find that he had been sent out, called of God, to go out and tear down or destroy the Amalekites. They had been opposed to God's people all along, all the way from the exit from coming out of the wilderness and going in, trying to go into the promised land. They had opposed the people of God, and God wanted them wiped out. And so Samuel had told Saul that, and so Saul did what he had said, at least in part. Chapter 15, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you as king over the people, over his people, over Israel. Now, therefore, listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has, and do not spare him, but put him to death, both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep and camel and donkey. Now, this is a very serious requirement, order from God, and Saul apparently appears to obey that, though. In verse 4, Saul summoned the people and numbered them in Telem, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. Saul came to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the valley. Then verse 7, Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as you go up to Shur, which is east of Egypt. He captured Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. So at first appearance, it seemed like that Saul had obeyed God and done God's will. But as you know, what we found out is, first of all, it says there in verse 8 that he saved Agag alive. He didn't kill the king. And then had preserved the best of the plunder in contrast or in disobedience to the will of God, in conflict with the will of God. And so Samuel came and said, you disobeyed God. And Saul said, no, I didn't. I obeyed God. Samuel said, no, you didn't. And then he tried to excuse it. Well, we're going to use these items that we preserved to worship God. And the idea being that, well, as long as we can disobey God, but claim that it's in the realm of serving God, then everything is good. And here's Samuel's great statement to him in verse 22 and 23. Has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination as iniquity and idolatry. And he goes on to say, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from him. And so he was rebuked for his disobedience. But we've already talked about that, so we're not going to spend a lot of time, or much more time on that tonight. What we want to do is look at verse 28 and the statement there in verses 28 and 29. There we see the declaration that he was going to bring a better man. Verse 28, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. And then he says, in case you don't get it, the Lord, the glory of Israel, will not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind. You've messed up, Saul. God has found a better man to take your place. Now, we're familiar with chapter 13. This is a passage. Let me just ask for a show of hands. How many of you think of this passage when you think of David versus chapter 13 and verse 14? Chapter 13, verse 14, if you'll look back there, says this. Chapter 13 is where a passage that we're all familiar with, or should be, or most of us are. It says, now your kingdom will not endure, or shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart. And the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Now, when he says that, David may have been not even a 10-year-old boy, just a young man. But already God has picked him out and seen him, and he says he's a man after God's own heart. So we're more familiar with that one than we are with the phrase, a better man, that we see here in chapter 15. But it's important to see that David, how God sees David in contrast to Saul. God has prepared this better man to be the new king of Israel, to take Saul's place. And so what we're going to do over the next few Sunday nights is dig deeply into the life of David and his impact on the nation of Israel and the history of the world. Not only did David have a great impact on Israel, he had a tremendous impact on the nation of Israel. I haven't done the research on this yet, but at least one source I was looking at said that David is mentioned in the Bible far more times than Jesus. He is the most named individual in the Bible. And that wouldn't surprise me. I'll have to do some research to see if that's correct. But he is significant, and he's at the very end of the Bible, at the beginning of the New Testament, and at the end of the New Testament, David is mentioned there in connection to Jesus Christ. But what we want to do tonight is look at David's humble origins. We're just going to be looking at a few things about his origins, and we're going to see how they were humble, and instead of some grand and glorious kid raised in the lap of luxury and raised to be the next king, came from a very, very humble background. And then at the end, we'll have some takeaways, hopefully, that will help us see how not only is this important to us from the standpoint of David's role, but also what we can learn from it and how it can give an example to us and give us hope in our lives as well. Well, let's look first of all at the humble origins, and we're going to start with a humble village. He was just from a humble village. This is why we're in 1 Samuel 16. Let's read verses 1 through 5. Now the Lord said to Samuel, this is 1 Samuel 16. Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have selected a king for myself among his sons. But Samuel said, how can I go? When Saul hears of it, he will kill me. So there's conflict between Saul and Samuel, because remember in chapter 15, what prompted that, he's giving it to a better man statement, was when Saul reached out and grabbed Samuel's coat and said, no, you're going to stay here with me, and tore it. An act of assault and violence against God's anointed judge. So there's animosity. And so if Saul finds out that he's anointing a king, then he'll come after Samuel and after David, whoever it is that's anointed. And so God says, the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Which is true. He's coming. He's going to make a sacrifice to the Lord. There's going to be there's an ulterior motive to it, but he's going to have a celebration with the village and select one of Jesse's sons as king. Verse 3, you shall invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me the one whom I designate to you. So Samuel did what the Lord said and came to Bethlehem. And I want you to notice the elders, how they are reacting to this. And the elders of the city came trembling to meet him and said, do you come in peace? Now you would think that this is the judge of Israel, that Samuel would be somebody they would be excited about him coming there, but they know there's conflict between him and Saul, and they know all the problems going on. And so they're kind of worried about how that may unfold. And so Samuel says to them in verse 5, in peace, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. He also consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. And so these villagers, they're not significant, and so they're sitting there thinking, you know what? I don't know why Samuel's here. I don't want him. We don't want him here. We want to just get on with our lives and not have this attention drawn to us. And so they have to get. So Samuel gives them a sense of peace and saying, I'm here to offer a sacrifice. We're going to sacrifice to the Lord together. So make yourselves holy and prepare for the sacrifice. And what this tells us is that they're just an insignificant village. They're not a big city. They're not a big concern. They're just a small village of people living their lives, trying to the best of their ability, hopefully, at least some of them, trying to serve the Lord to the best of their ability. In fact, when you think about Bethlehem, we might be tempted to think, well, it's an important city, because doesn't Micah chapter 5 and verse 2 talk about this? Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, if you'll turn over there and look at it, and I want you to take the time to read it, because it does talk about the city of Bethlehem. But the problem is, it was written 300 years after David, or more than 300 years after David. Micah chapter 5, though, says this. In chapter 5 and verse 2, it says, but as for you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah. So it's so small and so it's insignificant that even though it's being mentioned in a prophecy by God's prophet, he says, you're so little, it's not hardly worth mentioning you. Then he goes on to say, from you, one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity, giving the idea of the eternal nature of the one who would come from Bethlehem as ruler. And we know that that's speaking of Jesus. And we also know that this is a passage that the men figured out to explain to the wise men. You want to know where this child has been born that's going to be king of Israel? It's in Bethlehem. And they sent him there based on that. But this was written 300 years. So that's not telling us that Bethlehem was a big city. And even then, when it was written 300 years after David had arisen from there as his king, it's a nothing village. So it's an insignificant city with insignificant town where this young man is growing up. But not only is it insignificant, the first reference to it is actually all the way back in Genesis. Go back to Genesis chapter 35, and the first reference to it is where Rachel died and is buried. In Genesis chapter 35, verse 19, that she's giving birth to Benjamin, and she dies and is buried there in Bethlehem. This is verse 19, Genesis 35. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, which is mentioned in Micah 5. That is Bethlehem. So that's where she died, and she was buried there. So other than that, it's hardly ever mentioned. It's mentioned a few other times in the Old Testament, but between then and David. But it's not a big deal. It's just not a big deal. And so here comes Samuel to this village, this insignificant village, where the elders are scared to death because they don't feel worthy of such a visit. And they know of Saul's conflict with Samuel. And so they're worried about being a bug squashed between two estranged or conflicting leaders of Israel. That's what they're worried about. And what that means is they have no power to deal with Samuel or Saul, either one. So it's a humble village. So his humble origins start in a humble village. Now the next thing we want to look at is his family, his humble family. Let's look at verses 5. Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 16, and let's look at his family. Because there's nothing in the text indicate that his family is of any significance either. Beginning in verse 5, go back to last half of verse 5. He also consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they entered, he looked at Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Now, what's not really clear here is how much he's told Jesse about what the purpose is. It's obvious he's not telling the whole village why he's there, but he's bringing these sons. And so you don't know if this is internal dialogue or if he's saying these things to Jesse as well. I don't know. And I'm not going to make a guess on that. Then Jesse, but except that Jesse knows that whatever Samuel's doing, Abinadab's not the guy. Why he's looking at him, it's not Abinadab. Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. So apparently I think he's saying that to him, but it's not this one. And then verse 10, thus Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. And Samuel said to Jesse, are these all the children? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, and behold, he's tending the sheep. Then Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here. And you want to talk about awkward? That would be an awkward moment. Every time I read this, I think about that. It's like everybody's standing for the prayer. And then we say, okay, wait a minute, let's have the song. And then there's a long pause while I say, well, I've got to go get my songbook out of the car. So y'all just stand there and wait while I go get my glasses or whatever it is that I need out of the car. By the way, I do have to stop right there and I'll pause and apologize. I have to thank these two right here, Gary and Bridget especially. Bridget found out that I didn't lock my car keys in my car this morning. And instead of leaving me here to try to get my wife to drive all the way up here with ours, she came up, and she and Gary came up, and they got AAA out here to get my car unlocked. So, thank you. I forgot to say that at the beginning. All right. Anyway, now back to David. So David brings Jesse's boys come before him, and so there's nothing to indicate that these are important people in the village. And if you remember, there's something about the family of Jesse that you have to remember. Remember who is his grandmother? You remember Jesse's grandmother? A foreign woman named Ruth. Go back to Ruth chapter 4, or go back a few pages to Ruth chapter 4, and just remember there where we see how his grandmother, Jesse's grandmother, is not an Israelite. In verse 4, in chapter 4 of Ruth, it says this in verse 16. As they have a son, it says, then Naomi took the child that Ruth had, laid him in her lap, and became his nurse. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. So David's great-grandmother and Jesse's grandmother is a woman from another country. And like it or not, and even though the text doesn't get into this fact in detail, Deuteronomy says that no Moabite's supposed to even come into the temple until the 10th generation, and that the Israelites are not supposed to be marrying these foreign women, and they do it anyway. They do this anyway, and so they have this child. And you know that in a village, there's gossip going on. There's gossip. There's people there. There will have been people in that village that just simply cannot overlook the fact that, well, Jesse's grandma, she's a nice lady, but she wasn't an Israelite. It's just the way people are. And so that would have been hanging over them. And so that stigma of foreign blood that folks would have talked about, some folks would have talked about and possibly gossiped about. And then there's also the fact that these older sons look the part. They look like Saul, kingly. They look like the guy that would be the man. But there's something wrong in their hearts as well. They didn't have a heart for God. So in them, Samuel did not find the better man. They just weren't it. And so they make some call for David. And that gets us to the last point, and that is that he is just a humble boy. He's just a humble boy. And there are a lot of things about David that stand out in this text, and we'll spend some time. And there's some other things that we could guess about, but I think I just want to point out just these things about it. He's so insignificant that his dad overlooked him. Samuel's there, bring all your sons, bring all your boys. Mm, mm, mm. Is that it? Oh, yeah. There's David, but he's out with the sheep. So he either just flat out forgot him, or probably more likely, just didn't think that if these other boys weren't going to measure up, then it ain't going to be David. David's not the guy. So his own father's looking down at him as insignificant. And then you add to that the fact that he's a shepherd. He's got the lowliest job in the village, watching sheep. The shepherd is not going to be usually your brightest bulb in the pack. Sharpest knife in the deck, whatever, in the drawer, whatever illustration you want to leave or use. Because they're just sitting out there in the field, in the woods, watching the animals. They're not the guy that's inside in town learning how to be a blacksmith or learning how to be a carpenter like Jesus and his father and his stepfather Joseph were. He's not learning a trade. He's out watching the sheep. Not a job that's going to raise you to heights, at least in the mindset of people. They just don't think that that's going to be the prelude to greatness. What's your resume? I keep sheep. Next. That's just the way it's going to be. So they don't think highly of him in that respect. And then the other thing is, he was a musician. He was just a musician. Unlike his older brothers who were the real warriors. Remember, 3 of them were working with Saul in battle against the Philistines. So his older brothers were manly men going out, and David's a shepherd, and he plays his flute, and he makes up songs. He's one of those guys, as the thinking that they're going to have. Let's be honest. All right, let's be honest. The third string tight end for a high school football team can fall on a fumble to save homecoming, so they win homecoming and become the most famous person in that school, even though they have no physical ability and they're not really all that good at football in the first place, but they are famous. And 20 years later and 30 years, remember when you fell on the ball and you saved homecoming? Woo-hoo-hoo. Tell me who's your best drummer in the band that marched at halftime. Yeah, don't know. Who's the best trumpet player? Don't know. Nobody cares about that. That's just reality here in America. And I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that's reality. And so David's the guy, and I know we got a professional musician here in the building. So, and I would bet you that you would say that a lot of times you probably get that kind of reaction from people. Oh, you're a musician. And musicians are great. In fact, I played football, and I was pretty good at it in high school. And you know what? I block and tackle people all the time. I use those things I learned on the football field all the time. No, I don't. I don't. But that's our mentality. That's the mindset of us. How many of you watch football this afternoon? Because it's the big thing. The guys get up there and they're incredible what they can do. But it's not the most important thing in life. David remained a shepherd and musician, as a shepherd and musician, indicated that he wasn't the most manly guy around, and so he wasn't considered to be very important. So, humble village, humble family, humble boy. Let's just wrap up with some takeaways tonight, and then we'll finish this. And next week we'll come back with David as a bold believer. Let's look at some takeaways. First thing that we need to take away from this is that our origins are meaningless. It doesn't matter where we come from. and it simply doesn't matter. We could come from the most insignificant town in all of America and become great and special in the sight of God, because that's what was important anyway. In the sight of God, God doesn't care who you are and where you come from. He picked David because of David's heart. So our origins are meaningless. The other thing is our family does not define us, for good or bad. We can have the best family in the world, the most famous and the most well-known in town, and we can end up as nothing nobodies, or we can end up as faithful Christians serving God faithfully. There's a guy there's a guy in my hometown, and my cousin and he were good friends. My cousin, who is a gospel preacher that's coming next fall for the gospel meeting here, and they were good friends. And I ask him every once in a while, "What have you heard anything about Brent?" He said, "Well, he's out of jail." It's a good friend of his but this was a guy who in high school, his family was one of the wealthiest families in town, had the biggest, the big house on the hill. They were just well-known, fancy, special people. And their son graduated from high school in 1977 as an alcoholic drug addict. He's been in and out of jail ever since. So family doesn't define us. So it's great to have a good family, and it's important to be good families. That's valuable. I love seeing all the great family relationships and dynamics here, and that's valuable. But that doesn't define us. Faith is what defines us. The third thing is our skills don't give us value. So it's not about, well, I'm good at this or I'm good at that. Those, again, not to demean those things, but that's not what gives us value. What gives us value is a heart that is given to God. You want to be valuable in the kingdom of God? Have a good heart. Don't worry about where you came from. Don't worry about what your skills are from the standpoint of your faith. I'm not saying you always work on your skills. I encourage working on skills and getting better at whatever it is you want to do. But that's not what gives you value. Your faith and your obedience to the will of God is what gives you value. And your family doesn't define you. Now, again, we're blessed with good families here, and it's good to see. And so that point's kind of not that important here, but it's important from the standpoint of just because you got a good family doesn't mean that you're going to be special. What makes you special is what's in your heart. So that's our takeaways, and that's our lesson. David, a better man with his humble origins. Next week, I said we'll talk about him as a bold believer, beginning in chapter 17. Go ahead and get your songbooks out, and we're just going to end with one question. Like I said, the song, raise your hand if you've ever heard the song. Raise your hand. You've heard the song Better Man by Pearl Jam? Okay. I should have known you would. All right. So, yeah, it's an incredibly haunting song. And what that song should tell you and me, tell us, is strive to be the better man. And so that's what we're going to end with, is this question: are you a better man or a better woman? And it starts with a heart that's after God's own heart. Will you be that tonight? If we can help you tonight be a better man or a better woman in your service to God, and in your service to your family, and in your service to this church, please come and let us help you. Please come while we stand and while we sing.